Well, thank you. It's great honor to be here. Great pleasure. I'm an admirer and student of the works of Roger Scruton, among other things. I can't think of a person writing in my lifetime who expressed who had a command, you might say, of the full range of things that mattered, dealing with politics, with culture, religion, philosophy, the human soul, literature, and somebody who defended, uh, you might say, the integrity of those activities against various doctrines that attempt to subdeterminants, that explanations of human thought and action that don't sympathetically engage with the self understanding of human beings, but instead try to find explanations. What Mary Midgley famous called nothing buttery. The soul is nothing but the movement of neurons in the brain. Or as Marx famously said, all the um, all the thoughts and ideas and doctrines associated with philosophy, literature, art, political debate, and disputation are simply products of underlying and determinative socioeconomic forces. I think to understand that, to understand Roger Scruton's unsparing defense of, you might say, the integrity of the human person and his rejection of almost every form of scientism and ideology is a very good starting point for understanding his intellectual and moral project as a whole. Well, the book we're going to be making our way through for the next 4 weeks, today, and then again, I believe again on the 8th, the 15th, and the 29th, the 15th, 22nd, and 29th. The reason we were not meeting next week is I'll be flying to an event at Pepperdine University in Malibu, and I can't conduct a session from the airplane, but we will have all 4 sessions in November. The book we're going to be exploring together is, as Fisher had mentioned, was originally published in 1998 in Great Britain under the title of Modern Culture. Some of you may have that edition. The print is a little small. It was reissued in paperback in the year 2018. And here is the hardback issued by St. Augustine's Press in the year 2000 with a slightly different title, An Intelligent Person's Guide to Modern Culture. And for today, I had asked you to read the first 3 of the chapters for this book. It's a like some of Roger's books. Think of a book like Sexual Desire, 600, 700 pages. His wonderful sort of his articulation of a conservative approach to environmentalism, How to Save the Planet, is another very, very big book. But there are other books that are extremely compact. I would never say his books are dense. They're always written with literary grace and a certain accessibility, but they also demand the commitment of the reader. And they assume a certain learning, or at a minimum, I think they encourage the less than fully liberally educated to get a liberal education or to begin the odyssey of self discovery, self knowledge through liberal education with the help of Roger Scruton. So let me begin before turning to the text itself by commenting on the ubiquity and also what we might call the amorphousness of the term culture today. And Scruton does, I think, a terrific job of laying out different understandings of culture. He certainly highlights its ubiquity in philosophy, in the social sciences, in ordinary discourse. Um, and he clearly defends and articulates an understanding of culture that self consciously aims to avoid reductionism. In other words, he doesn't understand the high in light of the low. I was mentioning to Fisher as we were speaking before the session began that you'll see now, television shows where the announcer will excitedly announce that apes have culture because they've discovered some little tool that is evidence of the fact that culture is an integral part of the social life of apes. And clearly, that's a very reductive view of what culture is. There's also, as Roger points out, or Professor Scruton points out, a the approach of cultural studies, which manages to both be relativistic in failing to distinguish, or really self-consciously denying any distinctions between higher and lower human thoughts, achievements, aspirations, and and also emphasizes popular culture as a emancipatory activity. So the whole field of cultural studies today, I think sociology, which is uh, essentially, as my old friend Irving Lewis Horowitz used to say, contemporary sociology goes back and forth from left-wing ideology to aimless empiricism. Right. There are exceptions, glorious exceptions, but anyway, that approach to culture is reductive, relativistic, and um, and really at war with the idea that certain activities, aspirations, thoughts, affirmations, achievements can be judged to be integral to human flourishing, to human excellence. So that would be the bottom. And I think we don't have to look very far. We see people when in beginning in the 60s, we really saw a lot of lingo about the drug culture, the rock culture, various subcultures, ghetto culture. Culture understood in that way begins with the negation, the self conscious rejection of any distinction between higher and lower. Okay, we're not going to start there, but I wanted to start there, or at least mention that, because it seems to me that relativistic and reductionist understanding of culture is a powerful stumbling block to taking seriously older, um, you might say, much more substantial, much more spiritually enriching notions of culture. Uh, and um, and clearly, Scruton's understanding of culture, while not being, while it's not difficult to sort of pin it down to a single definition, and he doesn't try, it's clearly rooted in a rejection of that latitudinarian, relativistic, low, non judgmental account of culture. So we'll sort of get that out of the way and realize that, well, in the introduction to the 2000 edition of this book, the St. Augustine's edition came out in hardback 2 years after the original English publication. Roger Scruton noted that some critics said, "Hey, you're not. This isn't about culture. He's not talking about TV. He's not talking about the full range of human activities." In other words, the critics complained that modern culture had an inordinate emphasis on high culture and not on the on popular expression as sort of the key to understanding the cultural dimensions of human life and human existence. So, in that sense, Roger Scruton, it's not a word he uses particularly because it's a pejorative, but his approach is undeniably elitist in the sense that it recognizes, accepts, and builds upon a fundamental distinction between higher human aspirations and achievements and those that are, if anything, less reflective of noble human possibilities. All right, so let's turn to the text. I asked you to read 3 chapters for today. I think most of our readings will consist of about 3 chapters, seldom more than 30 or 40 pages. So nothing too onerous, especially for the next session, since you have 2 good weeks to prepare. Not bad. Um, Scruton's book begins as it ought to begin, with the question, what is culture? You may remember that Plato's Socrates is famous for his what is questions. The question, Socratic inquiry or interrogation is, and often Plato Socrates is he ends up with aporia. He's clarified the nature of the question without giving a definitive answer to questions like what is justice, the republic, what is piety, etc. But one can make progress in the understanding of the question without arriving at a firm and definitive answer to the question. So Scruton starts Socratically at the beginning. What is culture? And I think one thing becomes very apparent as one reads the opening chapters of this book. Culture finally has inescapable links to cult, to religion, to the sacred. These are important categories for Scruton. They're important categories for any understanding of what culture is. And yet, culture, especially high culture, culminating in the modernism, let's say, of a T.S. Eliot in the 20th century, involves in part, it becomes necessary when things like authority, things like the sacred, things like immutable religious truth are challenged widely. And I think one of the really interesting things about this book, and I think one of the really interesting things about Roger Scruton's thought and reflection and writing is he is somebody who is both a partisan of high culture, of a non reductive understanding of culture, but he is also somebody who sees the category of the sacred as something that human beings can never escape or overcome without losing their humanity and without losing their human dignity. And yet, at the same time, I think Scruton believes there's a wonderful remark in one of Nietzsche's works where he says, whisper to the conservatives, only a crab can crawl backwards. In other words, we can't simply go back to the world, to the pre enlightened world of enchantment. Disenchantment is a concept that the German sociologist Max Weber had introduced, although many Enlightenment or post Enlightenment philosophers, sociologists, and others had similar ideas that a certain alienation accompanies modern Enlightenment because we cannot rely with the same confidence, with the same surety on the old verities. Now, a thoroughgoing approach to enlightenment, as Scruton points out, is very tempted to throw the baby out with the bath, to say, um, because the old religions or the old religious authority does not speak with the same commanding voice as it once did, there is no sacred, there is no authoritative, there is no hierarchy of human goods. And I think the tension that animates Roger Scruton's philosophical reflection is that he recognize he recognizes in a very open way that we live in a disenchanted world, but he also sees quite profoundly the limits of enlightenment, the limits of any effort to articulate the human soul or the human condition in a way that does away with the truth of the soul and you might say, the profound presence of the sacred in the very structure of reality and human life. So I think we ought to keep our eye on that tension because I think it's a tension. There's debates. How much of a religious believer is Roger Scruton? And I think the debates on that question are tied to that very tension between the sacred and high culture that I just tried to elucidate. All right. So back to the question, what is culture? In the first chapter, Scruton introduces two notions of culture that he refuses to choose between. One notion, both I would call high notions of culture, although I think both are capable of what I would call vulgarization and debasement. By the way, all ideas are capable of vulgarization and debasement, but some with much more dangerous effects than others. So the first Scruton associates with Johann Gottfried Herder, a figure very important for German Romanticism and the Counter Enlightenment, probably less well known in Anglo American circles. It's another thing about Scruton. He was educated in the English tradition, but he knew continental philosophy and classical philosophy exceedingly well. He knew analytic philosophy, but he finally, I think, is not an analytic. But we can talk about that if we want more clarity on what all that means. So for Herder, Herder was reacting, as Scruton, I think, very nicely points out, to a certain understanding of enlightenment as pure universalism, that there's one political order for humanity, that there's one moral code for humanity, that there's one set of cultural arrangements that fit the universal nature and requirements of human beings. And I think Herder was not an extreme thinker, um, but he thought that there was something lifeless and bloodless about the kind of Enlightenment universalism that ignored the particularism and specificity of the life of a people or a nation. So, as Scruton says on the first page of chapter one, Kultur for Herder is the lifeblood of a people, the flow of moral energy that holds society intact. And Herder was one of the first um, philosopher, thinkers, theorists to introduce this very Germanic distinction between culture and civilization. Civilization was the veneer of manners, law, and especially technical know-how. By the 19th century, there were a lot of German philosophers, Nietzsche among them, at the end of the 19th century, who would attack England. England was utilitarian. It was all about technique. It was all about civilization. Well, the Germans had culture. They had culture, and this often led to a kind of cultural relativism where each people had its distinctive culture, and you might say that the concerns with technocratic, utilitarian uh, civilization were sort of beneath contempt. I think that understanding of the superiority of high, if diverse and even relativistic cultures versus low, degrading technocratic culture is probably best expressed in the 20th century by an author whose book is better known than read, Oswald Spengler and the Decline of the West. And by the way, Scruton has a very good essay dealing with the strengths and weaknesses of Spengler's thought. I think it's chapter 2 of The Philosopher at Dover Beach, his best collection of essays. Um, so that's the first understanding of culture. The things that define the lifeblood, the moral substance, the spiritual essence of a people. And that means its language, its art, its religion, its history. And there's no doubt Scruton thinks there's a good deal of truth to this understanding of culture. Okay. On the other hand, there's a second understanding that's perhaps more universalist, but it's also aristocratic and hierarchical in the sense of natural aristocracy. And that would be the view of civilization articulated by Humboldt in the 19th century, perhaps by T.S. Eliot in the 20th century. Uh, and This notion of culture emphasized literally the etymological root of the idea in Latin. We can have the cultivation of the land, but we can have also the cultivation of the mind and soul. And I think a lot of notions, just like Herder's idea, can give rise to an emphasis on folk culture, national traditions. Some of the Russian Slavophiles would talk about the unique essence or soul of the Russian people, the Russian peasants. Certainly Dostoevsky spoke that way in a Herderian way. This notion, you might say the neoclassical notion of culture, emphasized the long, arduous road of self cultivation of soul and mind, especially through liberal education, through reading great books, by learning classical languages. Maybe at its best, keeping together the two parts of the soul that Blaise Pascal talked about, the esprit de géométrie that emphasizes the precision of science and mathematics, and the esprit de finesse that he spoke about that has to do with the truths of the soul, how hard it is for one human being to keep those two parts of the soul together. So the second classical understanding of culture is really the high culture that aims to develop the spiritual and intellectual and moral capacities of human beings to their fullest. Sometimes students of Aristotle will talk about human flourishing, right? Human flourishing is a kind of excellence. So when I say that understanding of culture is aristocratic, I don't mean it's just for people with like counts or prince in front of their name. I meant it's a manifestation of the highest possibilities of the human soul. If you want to think of somebody who, for a century, was considered to have fully embodied culture in that sense, I think it would be Goethe, who was a scientist, a novelist, a philosopher, a man of letters, a man of humane judgment. You know, he wrote on the theory of color, and he wrote on young Werther, the sorrows of young Werther. He wrote Faust. He was a Renaissance man at a time when the encyclopedists and the Enlightenment were telling us you can't really have Renaissance men anymore. Okay, so this distinction between two approaches to culture, they're really the highest definitions of culture that Scruton presents early in the book. Now, I've already mentioned some of the lower, more demotic or vulgar or relativistic notions of culture. Today, some people refer to all social communities as tribes, as if, our identifications, our affectations, our choices, our practices, our moral judgments are simply tribal. So we use terms today like identity. We speak about identity politics. And in the crudest form, we act as if you're born into a certain tribe or race or identity, you're stuck there. There's this absurd notion. I'm editorializing here. I'm allowed to do that from time to time. Uh, Cultural appropriation, as the social scientist Thomas Sowell pointed out. Well, the whole history of the world is cultural appropriation. The Roman Catholic Church, brought together the wisdom of the Hebrew Scriptures, uh, many of the truths of Greek philosophy. The very language of the Gospel of John begins with the appeal to the Logos, a category of Greek and Stoic philosophy. And of course, the church is unthinkable without the accretions of Roman law, etc. So, three great cities came together in the soul and practices of the Roman church. If we forbid cultural appropriation, we forbid, if we close every culture in on it in itself, we deny universality altogether. So I think it's Scruton is with Herder in saying that a bland, doctrinaire, leveling universalism that denies variety is suffocating of the human spirit. But he's also with Eliot and Humboldt in saying that people everywhere in different times and climes, different cultures, aspire to the truth of the soul, which has a certain universality to it. And I think if we keep our eye on that dialectic between the particular and the universal, between the Herderian and the Humboldtian notions of culture, we're not only going to have an important key to this book, we're also going to have an important key to the larger cultural and philosophical and religious reflection of Roger Scruton. Um, the second and longest chapter is called Culture and Cult. And it is of this one, perhaps we can unpack it with more detail and energy during the discussion period. But in this chapter, Scruton, he doesn't provide with an argument with apodictic certitude, but he argues, I think, through a series of illustrations, through a series of points. I think he argues very suggestively that the core of common religion, common culture, is religion, and he introduces a series of concepts, ideas, and distinctions that are going to be very central for his argument as we proceed. So, for example, you might say, "Well, what does religion have to do with culture?" And I think Scruton would say everything, and I think he would say that at the meeting of culture and cult are various notions that continue to define the human engagement with reality. And that is such notions as pollution. By the way, I'm not talking about smog in LA. We're talking about moral pollution. The fact that human beings have an experience, it seems to be a primordial experience. Every human community, even if this is initially expressed in mythic form, has the experience of pollution, separation, or fall. That the sense that we human beings, and this is not just for the palpable fact that we're sinners, that we the drama of you of good and evil is coextensive with the human condition, but also this sense that there's something we have to atone for, and that repentance and sacrifices and the rituals and liturgies that define the religious life are central to the overcoming of this sense of both pollution and radical incompleteness. And so the sacred begins with a series of rituals uh, that, in effect, attempt to atone for the fact that there is something the matter with human beings. But as religion um, develops, one might say the theological and philosophical sophistication of the sense and the experience of the sacred develops. And so there's a movement from the primordial fact of pollution to a new sense of moral and spiritual purity. And I think on page 6 is a wonderful expression of Scruton where he says, human beings move in such a world and such a understanding from separation to communion, from fall to redemption. Um, and there's lots of interesting discussions along the way. It's very common for critics of religion, from the new atheists to the moqueries of Voltaire. The French refer to le ton de Voltaire. He mocked revealed religion. Even Swift, Dean Swift, who was the head of the Anglican Cathedral in Dublin. But in book one of Gulliver's Travels, we've got him mocking the little enders and the big enders. How you break an egg, which is a lot like people fighting over consubstantiation and transubstantiation, and no real presence at all in the Eucharist. And from a certain Enlightenment point of view, all of those distinctions are nonsensical. But Scruton reminds us that the emphasis on fidelity to receive tradition, ritual, and then in religions of the book, when the texts are sacred, but yet in need of interpretation, mediation, an excessive departure from the original meaning of the word or for the original practice of the ritual can be extremely jarring for a sacred community. Scruton gives one example that I'm very familiar with because I study Russian things and one of the hats I wear. And it's hard to believe that the Russian church broke up between the official church, the Orthodox Church, and the so called Old Believers, the schismatics in the 17th century, over whether you should do the sign of the cross with two fingers or three. And in fact, the Old Believers, who are still around, um, underwent significant persecution for refusing to accept Patriarch Nikon's reforms. So Scruton suggests, it's really easy to say, "Oh, this is completely silly," and that's what rationalists do. But Scruton reminds us that fidelity to the rituals and the texts by which redemption, and you might say the communing of what in a philosophical idiom T.S. Eliot called the coming together of the time and timeless, or what we might call in theological language the meeting of the natural and the supernatural. All of that depends on a certain solidity of these sacred symbols and of these rituals and experiences and texts that mediate the relationship between cult and culture, the sacred um, and ordinary human life. So we shouldn't be so quick to adopt le ton de Voltaire. These silly religious people, they take all this stuff seriously. It's all superstition. I think one of the great things about chapter 2 is that Scruton shows us that there's an awful lot of moral and spiritual and rational import inherent in the whole realm of cult, in the whole realm of the sacred. Um, um, he's got a wonderful discussion of a section in Homer's uh, Odyssey where one of Odysseus's companions who dies and is unburied appears in a dream to Odysseus, and he needs to be buried and honored and mourned for all to be right. And I think Scruton's explication of that text shows us um, how seriously our forebears how serious the reflection was about the rituals that are not irrational, but are inescapable vehicles for doing justice to the things of the soul and to the realm of the sacred. Uh, to bring something much closer to home, less noble, less elevated, Scruton talks, as he does in much of his work, about how so much of our time is marked by desecration. Um, I'm going to quote a line from page 9. The sexual revolution of modern times has disenchanted the sexual act. Sex has been finally removed from the sacred realm. It has become my affair, in which we no longer show an interest. The deconsecration of the reproductive process is the leading fact of modern culture. Those are very strong words. And I should say, Roger Scruton wrote an entire book about it called Sexual Desire. And when you eliminate that notion of pollution, when you desacralize human sexuality, when it is no longer an encounter of an I with a thou, to use the famous personalist dialectic of Martin Buber from the early 1920s, and it becomes a free choice of two bodies. Even Kant, the intellect, one of the intellectual heroes of Roger Scruton, once defined marriage, and I want you to be prepared to be jarred a little bit. He defined marriage as a contract for the mutual manipulation of genitalia. Now, if that isn't the desacralization of marriage, what is? Now, there is mutual manipulation of genitalia that goes on in marriage and in the sexual act, but to define it in that way is to essentially desacralize it. And one of the things Scruton tried to do in his philosophical work was to show that sexuality is always the experience and encounter and communion of mutually accountable persons. And we don't just love a body that we can manipulate, but we love a person who is an ensouled body. And that's a big difference. And our culture is indeed in danger of losing that. Pages 10 and 11, um, Scruton reminds us that central to the official ideology of the modern Enlightenment is a reduction of almost all human relations, almost all human affairs, almost all human connections to contract. Um, uh, Obligations are good because we've assented to them. Um, the founding political myth of modern liberal societies is the social contract. Going back to his 1979 book, The Meaning of Conservatism, uh, uh, Scruton has always challenged the idea that social membership is simply a free choice. He is much more sympathetic to Burke's notion that the social order, the civic body, the political community is a contract between the living, the dead, and the yet to be born. I think Burke saw uh, the French Revolution as almost demonic in its consequences because it denied those bonds that are holy, that connect the dead, the living, and the yet to be born. And modern ideological revolution becomes a dictatorship of the living against our forebears and against those who are yet to come. And that's why it paradoxically takes on terroristic effects and consequences. Um, One other theme I want to introduce from chapter 2 and this is so important, not only for an understanding of culture, but also for an understanding of Roger Scruton's thought. Um, Scruton shows us the integral connection between high culture, religion, and what he calls the ethical vision of human beings. He places a lot of emphasis on the human form, the human face, the human person. We are not simply bodies, matter in motion, who are freely consenting or not consenting to various deeds or misdeeds. We are persons who are accountable, as Scruton says on page 11, for the deeds of today, the deeds of yesterday, and the deeds of tomorrow. And that means we human beings living in an immanent world never really lose touch with what Kant called the transcendental self. The locus of our freedom is that we have a capacity for free will and for practical wisdom that the tradition associates with the soul, the spirit, the self, the human face. This ethical vision confers value on the human form, on the human face, the human deed, and the human world. It permits the higher emotions through which we ennoble our lives and the lives of those around us. And it allows the erotic, for example, to be understood in a way that does not sever our bodies from our transcendental selves. All right. And Scruton just thinks he loves that quote from Burke in the Reflections on the Revolution, the dust and powder of individuality. We are always a we persons live in the first person plural, to use one of Scruton's great expressions. If we think of ourselves through the dust and power of individuality as simply consenting to anything, choices between consenting adults, we have in effect reduced ourselves to something that really wars with the integrity, the rights and duties, the mutual accountability, the sacred that informs even a free society. And we've lost touch with our higher selves. And again, you don't have to be a religious believer to believe that in the irreducibility of personhood or the soul to something other than itself. Finally, and I am moving ahead to the very brief final chapter on enlightenment. And here I bring this to a full circle because I began by saying that we have to acknowledge that we live in a largely, partly, and mainly uh, disenchanted world. We live in the world of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is not easy to define. Or maybe we live in the age of the post Enlightenment now, a kind of irrationality that goes even further, a rejection of rational norms that goes even further than the Enlightenment did in trying to tear down standards of authority and judgment. But the original Enlightenment, as the 18th century Enlightenment, was not reducible to a single current. Um, but it did have defining characteristics that have gone a long way to shaping and informing modern culture. One of those is a de emphasis precisely on Herder's point that a people define themselves in terms of place, history, tribe, or destiny. Um, doesn't mean those things have gone away. And Roger Scruton was a great philosopher of the nation as essential territorial democracy as central to democratic self government. But the whole thrust of the Enlightenment is toward universalism. Kant even imagined a universal federation of commercial republican states. Although he added, because he was never too estranged from sobriety, political sobriety, that a world state would be a soulless despotism. And he was right about that. Enlightenment is defined by the retreat of the sacred, the decline of religion, um, 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 and with people like Voltaire and Kant, and I think in a much more respectable and decent way than Voltaire, really put forward a rational religion that de-emphasized ritual and the sacred and the church as a mediation between the lonely self and the supernatural realm. Authority increasingly loses its grip in modern culture. Um, and more people place emphasis. So that's the original Enlightenment. But then you come to somebody like Marx in the mid 19th century and the whole Marxist movement of the 19th and 20th century, and you see a effort to explain away even Enlightenment reason as a cover for some more fundamental, monstrous, oppressive, and exploitative forces. And so Marx doesn't really believe in reason in the Enlightenment sense. He believes that um, high culture, art, philosophy, religion, politics are all reducible to class conflict and to the larger realm of what he called oppressive bourgeois domination. But he still believed in those class categories. Now, the postmodernists, and by the way, Scruton does not hesitate in later chapters to refer to the devil's work, the systematic assault on the sacred, on religion, on reason, on practical wisdom, the reduction of the entire human world to power relations, what we see especially in Michel Foucault. He sees that as a reflection of the father of lies. It's not true. Love and trust and community and friendship and right feeling and the I thou relationship and rational disputation about the advantageous and the just, to quote Aristotle. Those are real things. And when we explain them away in the name of power relations, we're going to end up with a comprehensive nihilism. So I'm going to end there. But all these themes are going to come back. But first, the tension, which is very real, and we have to respect it, between the substantial Herderian notion of culture and the classical notion of high cultivation and aspiration of a Humboldt and Eliot. Then the essential connection between culture, cult, and the sacred, and all its accompanying notions from pollution and atonement to the ritual that puts us in touch with the supernatural realm, then the disenchantment of the world, and then enlightenment, but enlightenment that increasingly turns against itself. It turns against the sacred, it turns against the dignity of the person, it turns against reason, and in the end, you end up with a comprehensive nihilism. So there's an awful lot going on in those first three chapters.